first step is often looking at how you're digesting stress. And that's not to sort of belittle any of the other symptoms, but if you're feeling incredibly anxious and incredibly stressed, a bit to your point around sleep, nothing else is going to work as effectively as it should.
I'm Anne-Marie McQueen, journalist and proud 50-ish woman, and we are here looking for the true truth in perimenopause, menopause, midlife, and beyond.
Opening our minds to other possibilities is not always easy.
Pop, I think.
You're all woman to me. All right, Anne-Marie.
Hi, Rebekah. It's such a pleasure to see you and always to talk to you. We've spoken several times behind the scenes. You're one of my favorite people.
It's both ways.
So first of all, I want to ask you where you are in menopause and perimenopause. Have you gone through it? Are you going through it? What's going on?
The $1 million question. Well, I'm definitely going through it. So my perimenopause journey began when I was about 43. A bit like you, I didn't know that was what was happening because no one had told me to expect it. And I certainly didn't expect the type of symptoms that I was struggling with to be associated with this kind of hormonal shift, because all of my associations were the result of all of the media stories and the narratives we've inherited as a generation. So it began in 43. I'm now 50. I think that I'm about to tip into postmenopause, which I'm bizarrely kind of curious and excited about, which sounds really odd, but we'll come in to talk about why in a minute. But, I haven't had a bleed for 7 months. I have been here before though. So, who knows? But I think I'm heading into my postmenopausal years. And because I'm a researcher, I'm quite smug in that I feel like I'm statistically bang on, because usually, obviously 51, 52 is statistically when most of us will find ourselves at that point, which is probably will be right for me. I'm 51 in November.
Isn't that, it's so interesting. Someone very close to me just got her period and we were like, worrying, why is it taking so long, and all her friends, and, and then it just came. I had stopped thinking about it. I don't know whether she had, and it was like, we talked about it, and I got off the phone and I thought, oh my gosh, this is just so funny. It's just like the one thing, it comes and it goes, and there's just literally nothing we can do.
I know. And I don't know with you as well, but I felt a very noticeable shift in my body, my mind, the way I just feel about the world, the way I feel about myself, that has kind of accompanied this transition. That's been fascinating for me as well. Apart from that kind of the very physical symptoms of, irregular periods and painful periods and periods that don't come and then they do come, and then, floods. I've had all of that. That's been, a journey. But I think also I've become more and more conscious of the sort of the shift and transition for me as a human, which I'm beginning to embrace. And I kind of get the sense that you are as well in some of the reflections you've been sharing.
Yeah, it's really something else. And I always want to give air to the suffering, because there really is real suffering. I have really good friends that are beside themselves, especially with sleep. And if you can't sleep, then everything falls down. But I also, I was always saying this is going somewhere good, because I would see these like really self-possessed, happy older women. And I can say like something shifts significantly. Yeah. And I just want people to hang in, because you come into your own, and it's not all at once. I mean, it's over such a long period, but then you just get these spotlights of it, right? Like just these moments.
Yeah.
So, but in the middle of all of this, you have launched a company. And that's no small task in a really interesting space. So you launched a company, but then you transitioned that company and changed the name, which is so ballsy, Rebekah. It's terrifying. Like for me, you just find this name that you're happy with. So tell me about Liminal and what's been going on.
Well, I think unlike you, the story of our company name previously was an accident. So my background is obviously research, so I'm almost embarrassed to admit that I did all the things that historically in my career prior to launching this ecosystem, I used to advise my clients not to do. I always used to say to them, get the name right from day one. Don't sub-optimize with the name, because it becomes a thing that you can't ever then part company with, and then obviously went and did exactly that myself. But the business, for those of your community listening who don't know us, was previously called MPowder, which actually was the name of my desktop folder when I got really unwell with perimenopause. So I was researching botanicals, and I bought a dehydration machine. And this is way before it was an idea for a community effort. I was just trying to get myself well again. And all of my recipes, all of my research into the powders I was using went into this folder on my desktop called MPowder. When we first came to test the work that I'd been doing, and by this point I was better, I'd really become incredibly passionate about the potential of plants and botanicals, and all of the different sort of groups within that family of that Mother Nature gifts us, so the adaptogens, the demulcents, all of these amazing herbs. And I was working with an incredibly well qualified naturopath and herbalist by this point. We did, as we always do, a community test of our first ever product, which is PeriBoost. And we were working on the brand identity and trying to find a descriptor for what we were trying to build. And it was really hard because, as we'll come on to talk about, menopause as a label actually is incredibly unhelpful. All of the associations we have with it are incredibly tricky to unpick and incredibly personal. So I knew that it needed real thought, and we were giving it that. And then the pandemic hit, and we kind of were suddenly forced to make a decision on whether we took the trial product out to this community of women that had agreed to test and feedback on the efficacy of our product, or whether we held back, and we just didn't know what was happening. So in the end, we were very pragmatic. We said, just get the product out to these women, and we'll worry about the name later. And then the pandemic obviously went beyond what we thought would be a 6-week period. And then we were worrying about really real things. Like, it was a lovely problem to have. It's like, oh my goodness, the product's really making an impact, but we can't get the ingredients into the country, and there are no couriers working in the UK. And so for a very long time, the first year of our business was navigating all of these. I got so tired of the word unprecedented, all of these unprecedented events. And MPowder stayed, obviously, as the least of our concerns. Then we launched with retailers, then we became a D2C business. And then before you know it, MPowder is this descriptor, which is really unhelpful because it's a very product functional descriptor, and people assume that we're a very functional, product orientated business, when in fact we're a community, and at the heart of what we do is co-creation, innovation, research, content. I mean, our big reads and our love of the content you produce and how robust yours is. A lot of our work is around signposting, giving women agency, and yes, we produce these beautifully considered formulas that our community helps us work with. But when we were called MPowder, it was almost like no one saw any of the other stuff we were doing. And quite often it meant that our consumers critically weren't accessing all of the other stuff that came free. So this is a really long-winded answer, but Liminal came to be because I've spent the last 3 years listening to stories, which is my main job within the company. I'm a narrative researcher. And the more I listened to the lived experiences of midlife, the more I realized that this really isn't about just, and I say just consciously because it has a massive impact, as you say, but just our hormones. The implication for us is a complete transition. And that's what many of us want to talk about, actually. It's the swirliness, it's the chaos, it's the grief, it's the hope, it's the new opportunities. And again, to your point, recognizing it's not all unicorns and rainbows, and finding a way of describing it that accurately kind of gives permission for everyone to consider what happens as we go through it. And so the word liminal, when we finally landed on it and tested it, seemed to be such an open word to put meaning onto, because we don't use it in common parlance very often. It's used within psychological spaces, it's used within the wellness space quite often. But to recognize that a liminal space for some people can feel incredibly frightening and confusing and frustrating and unwelcome. But for others, it can feel really exciting. And that there is a transition through to something new felt like a much broader invitation for women to really explore what midlife is, because I think that's the conversation we're all increasingly wanting to have. So the name changed. It was horribly frightening, but it does feel like it has opened up a whole new conversation with our community, which has been really beautiful.
Yeah, and I imagine there's all the worries about social media and being recognized for the, all that stuff, but that will sort itself out. But that name feels so right to me, and I'm sure it does to you, which is why you picked it. And just it's just a beautiful way to describe just being in the middle of it. And so many of us just wanted to go back. Like any change, any shift, any hard thing, you just want out of it at a certain point. And who wouldn't want out of perimenopause for some of the things it serves up?
Yeah, absolutely.
But I just think it's beautiful. I just think it's a beautiful way to capture it. And the hope, I got a little like choked up when you were talking about those words, because I just really feel like, I really feel you captured it. It's wonderful.
That really means
bravo.
Oh, well, that means a lot coming from you. And I think one of our experts kind of described it really well for me. She was like, it's that, it's when you transition from no longer to not yet. And I thought both of those descriptions of the other territories are really soft and beautiful as well. And they made me well up a little bit, because that sort of no longer is often filled with grief and a sense of loss, isn't it? But not yet is full of potential, and yet you're in this middle. And I feel generally, that I hope is probably a better description. I hope that we are coming to a point in the conversation around female health where we can be more nuanced, and because we are complex, amazing creatures, aren't we? And I think we need permission to have more lyrical conversations, as well as just boiling it all down to biology.
Well, I know we share frustrations about the way the conversation has developed in the main, in the UK and in the US, but in the UK particularly, where it's just sort of this, women are suffering and this, you're keeping the solutions from them. And, it's deficiency and disease, and just this really negative story that doesn't even represent the half of it, but it does sell really well, I think. And we've seen that. So how's that going in the UK? How's that conversation in your place in it?
I think it's really fair. And again, as a narrative researcher, I think words are, well, they're so powerful, and that has often been my concern, because I think it's fair to say that the voices in this space all come pretty much, like 99.9% of them come from a place of good intent and a frustration that perhaps the education hasn't been available, the signposting hasn't been available, the quality of care isn't consistent. So depending on where you live and the doctor that you might get an appointment with, you'll have a very different response to hormone therapy, and the misunderstanding around both its efficacy and its risk continues despite everyone's best efforts. So I always look at the conversation that's taking place in this space, and first and foremost appreciate the fact that most of these humans are just trying to do the right thing. But it's the use of the language, and it's the extreme nature of some of the dialogue that has meant that the worst thing for me is when I look at our community, because I think what it's meant for them is almost this paralysis, where when you see, unfortunately, doctors disagreeing with doctors, that doesn't serve me as a woman trying to navigate what is the right answer for me. It just makes me feel more fearful of everything. It's like, well, and quite often I'll just do nothing. And my concern also is that when there's only a black and white single solution for everybody, that also does a huge disservice to the brilliance of our biology, and it removes agency. And I was actually reading the Edelman Trust Barometer report, which comes out every year, and I find it a really interesting sort of macro trend analysis of what we're seeing in the world. And last year, it was quite a depressing read, because it was all around the loss of trust globally in pretty much every institution and system that exists. This year, they've honed in on AI, unsurprisingly, but they've also talked quite a lot about health, because healthcare particularly is seeing massive disruption as a result of AI as a innovation. And what they've concluded is the more agency you have for your own health, the more optimistic actually you are about the systems in which you have to navigate, but also critically, the better your health outcome. So we know from a researcher's point of view that if you're given agency, we will navigate better, and we will make the decisions that lead to better health. We aren't children, and we don't need to be told explicitly what to do and to have that agency removed. And I think my worry with some of the conversation is that in an effort to be explicit and clear, it becomes like this binary black and white sort of this is right and this is wrong. We remove agency first and foremost. We add confusion for the consumer who's trying to just be well and is on her knees. But also, you and I have spoken about this before, I think the saddest thing potentially is we kind of disincentivize curiosity, and we don't try things. And yes, there's snake oil out there, absolutely. And in the space that our supplements operate within, there's a lot of it. But also we are women in our 40s and 50s. We can spot snake oil pretty well. And we should have permission to try things, because science doesn't stand still. And there's very many interventions that we're beginning to realize with our Western research heads have huge potential for managing stress, managing cortisol, managing our hormone balance, which 10 years ago we were equally as wary of as we are potentially about botanicals today. So that's where the UK conversation is. It remains very binary, and I think potentially quite damaging to the very people that these individuals were hoping to support. And I think that is the thing that worries me at the moment. And I would really welcome a more nuanced conversation, because, back to the name change of our business and allowing women to talk to the swirliness of it all, we can hold that in our head. And I think we need to be given permission to have a much more open and intelligent conversation about this life stage as well.
You mentioned two things. So the brilliance of the human body, and then you've talked about narratives a lot, because that is part of your work. The narrative surrounding perimenopause and menopause is becoming overwhelmingly focused on the body not having an innate brilliance. Yeah. I feel the narrative is, no, your body's not smart. It's set up to sort of deconstruct at a certain age. And that's a crux of that argument. Like, and it's very compelling. It sounds like it makes sense, right? Like, we just weren't designed to be here this long. Like, our hormones run out. If men went through this, they would be getting treatment. Like, can you just speak a little bit about the narratives that you hear? Because you know about this. I always talk about the narrative because I know it's all narratives. Like, it's, there's people crafting these narratives to sell something, and it's very simple and it makes sense. And you don't really question it, because you're like, oh, okay. And if you don't know more, you're not going to question. You're going to think, yeah, I heard this doctor saying that, we used to all die at 50. And so, we're not designed, and we have no hormones left. And so we have to replace our hormones. Anyway, I'm rambling, but could you speak to that?
You're not rambling at all. And I love the fact that you very regularly take that particular statement or truism and give it context. I think that's often the challenge. And when you're looking at narratives, they often come, again, from a well-intentioned observational reflection that is taken out of context. And so it makes absolute sense. But actually, if you kind of put it back in context, i.e., why were women not surviving beyond 50 at certain points in history, and those that did, that managed to avoid, death in childbirth and all of the other things that we've managed to eradicate, that isn't then an argument that says our bodies weren't designed to live until their 80s and 90s, and yet it's been sort of extracted out to say, well, this was statistically when we died. Therefore, we're not supposed to be living this long, and therefore this is a deficiency, and this is therefore something we need to sort out. So no, I totally agree. Those narratives are incredibly challenging because they make sense. And I think also when you feel like your body is betraying you, which is often how we feel in the early stages of perimenopause, we've not been taught to expect it. We've not really ever learned about the kind of the potential if we harness our hormones for our long-term health. And I think that's probably the most critical thing around female health for me, is that because we're not taught about it, because it's not researched, and because there isn't the support and the systemic understanding of our unique biochemistry as opposed to males, everything feels like it's kind of against us, including our own bodies. The system's against us, the structure's against us, and then our bodies are against us. And then we're told that this is the result of an increased lifespan, and actually we weren't supposed to be here anyway. So this is a deficiency we need to address. It's a narrative that also makes the most sense, right? Rather than suddenly being told at the age of 40 that you've got 100 plus hormones coursing around your body that are amazing and all interdependent, and the sex hormone decline that takes place at this life stage impacts all of them. And that's why you're anxious, and that's why you're not sleeping, and that's why your gut is suddenly hating food that it was absolutely fine with 2 years ago, and that's why you're piling on weight even though you've not changed anything. And all of those things are much harder to deal with when they come as a shock and you're feeling really, really unwell. So I think, again, a more nuanced conversation where that doesn't actually in any way make it less helpful to have hormone therapy if that's what your body needs and that's what you choose to do. We don't need those really, really extreme narratives to make accessible the protocols and the medical interventions that we know are incredibly helpful and far less risky than our mothers thought. But it does frustrate me that we still lean on them as the rationale for doing it.
Yeah, we don't need them. And also it means that we're going on them with false information. Yeah. It means, if you're going on hormone therapy because you believe that we ran out of hormones and that's what you need to do to continue to age, that's a much different story, right? Mm-hmm. Than being like, okay, this will help me. This will support me. I may choose to go on them for a long time. I may choose to go on them for a shorter time. It's just not that stuff makes me crazy. Just have the correct information, and we don't need stories around this stuff. We just, the truth of it is compelling enough, I feel, but it's a little hard to impart. I agree. And narratives are crafted to sell us on things and make decisions easy. And so there we are.
Super
right?
easy.
This is
But I think that's why journalism, like deep journalism, which is the stuff obviously you do, is so important everywhere at this particular moment in time, but particularly I think when it comes to the female health space, where you're not only dealing with a massively underserved community in need of innovation and solutions, you're also dealing with a taboo topic where the sources that you might go to verify or have conversations with, if it was related to something else, aren't necessarily open to you, and so you're relying on these kind of these faces on Instagram, or these communities that you're going into relatively anonymously. They become incredibly important. And again, the interesting thing about the Edelman Trust Report is that we will believe these testimonials now as much as we would believe a good friend. So we're seeking advice in these kind of social environments that are algorithmically driven for clicks, for outrage, for provocation. But that's how many of us make decisions, particularly, I think, when it's a taboo topic that we may not turn to a friend to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, journalists in the UK, most of them who write about this are campaigners and activists. Yes. And so that's a different thing than a journalist.
Yeah,
it just is. But maybe it's changing. Maybe the role of journalism is changing. But I had an interesting exchange on Twitter once with a British journalist, and she said something like, well, I think we all kind of need to get in line, file in line like the journalists. And I remember thinking, yeah, I don't feel like that. I need to do that. I don't know that I need to get in line everyone's opinion and support this one thing. I just think I'll just keep asking questions, even though it might make me a pariah. But anyway,
I would say that is the role of journalism, though, is to ask the questions.
Yeah, it was. It's shifting in a lot of ways. But, anyway, there's a lot of independent of us running around.
Yeah.
I am curious to talk to you. When speaking of the brilliance of the body and the ingredients that you use, I want to get more into that. But just in this space, can you just speak a little bit about why we think it's so full of snake oil? You mentioned European testing issues to me. And I think that's really interesting. And then we also had a study that sort of created it. So if you could talk about the European testing.
I think the reason we think that there's so much snake oil in the space is that there is. So I think that is a reality. I think particularly interestingly in, again, the menopause space, because it wasn't an area of interest for most of these big pharmaceutical brands until relatively recently. So what you had was formulations that had been on market for a very long time with, low grade ingredients, pretty unbioavailable components chosen because they were cheaper from a vitamin and mineral perspective. And so those.
Sorry to interrupt. Can I just interrupt you for a sec, Rebekah? Too many ingredients, right? Like those menopause supplements with just a huge list of ingredients.
Yeah, also, exactly. So it's kind of that kind of just shove it all in. More is better in all instances, and don't revisit those formulations because that costs money, and actually this isn't a category that we're paying much attention to. And so many of those formulas had been on shelf for a very, very long time without any innovation coming in to disrupt the space. What has happened in the last 3 or 4 years is the space is changing, and you're getting high grade, carefully considered, synergistically formulated, often much simpler formulations actually that are designed to do a specific job coming into the market. But also you're having recognition now from the big pharmaceuticals and perhaps other actors that aren't so well intentioned, spotting a marketing opportunity, spotting a sales opportunity. And in the UK, they've their term for it. They call it meno washing, where you're seeing, brands that have traditionally not talked about menopause at all, suddenly using the same formula and sticking the word menopause at the front of it and charging more money. So there's that sense of optimism in that there is innovation and better products now available for all of us to consider trialing. There's also a lot more noise and a lot more snake oil. And back to the sort of the world of social media, it's very, very easy to launch a very low grade product and make it look brilliant. So it's really hard for us as women to navigate what is robustly considered and tested and worth perhaps considering against a really clever marketing machine that is pushing something to you that maybe isn't going to do much for you. And then we end up being cynical about supplements because our experience of them is pretty underwhelming. If you were someone that tried a low grade pharmaceutical blend that had been on shelf for the last 15 years, the likelihood is it won't have had much of an impact on your symptoms. So why would you try something new? You might just conclude that supplements just aren't worth your interest or your time, or more importantly, your budget. So I think that's why we think there's snake oil. And then you and I were talking, which I think is fascinating, just about, again, narratives. So one of the big narratives you see in the kind of like anti-supplement field will be that quite often the ingredients that are claimed to be in a product aren't in the product. There's concerns actually that there could be quite dangerous toxic elements within a product, and that there are no health claims associated with the botanicals that are starting increasingly to be promoted within the menopause space. And some of that may be true, but the reality actually is a lot more complicated, and that makes the narrative harder to communicate. But one of the biggest reasons that we don't see health claims associated with botanicals currently is that the European Food Standards Authority, which is the body that assesses clinical trial conclusions and then gives permission for companies like me to be able to assert health claims associated with ingredient, they've not approved one botanical trial since 2012. In part, that's down to backlog and bureaucratic challenges. But the other challenge we do face, which is an honest one, is that botanicals come from Mother Nature, and depending on harvest, depending on weather, depending on soil, what's actually in that plant differs wildly. And how can you then look to the potential of plants in a clinical setting and actually get sort of an interpretation of how well they can perform? So there are some bigger questions to be had that aren't nefarious or don't point to anything underhand. They just point to the fact that we need to have a grown-up conversation about how we can accurately understand these botanicals and their potential, because there's a huge history of traditional use in all of these botanicals. There's a lot of money from companies that don't necessarily have the backing of pharmaceuticals, where they've undergone clinical trials, they've presented their evidence and nothing has been done with it, which is hugely frustrating for companies like mine. But in addition to that, there are beautifully patented extracts from botanicals that have consistency that we're not allowed to talk about either. So you end up in this sort of situation where I think a lot of the negativity targeted towards botanicals comes from this narrative that says, a lot of things that actually the truth is a lot more complicated to convey.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know there's a section of people on social media and wellness people who will say, oh, they don't conduct clinical trials. It's a conspiracy by, the pharmaceutical industry or whatever. But I always find that there's just a lot of other reasons, just sort of bureaucratic backlog and ineptitude and people who don't know about it and shoving a file to the side. Those things are just a lot more possible a lot of the time than some grand conspiracy of the European, that body just saying no, we're not going to have any more. It just doesn't really. I don't feel like it works like that, right? And so I love that.
Yeah, well, I think nuance is so hard, isn't it? I mean, it's so. I mean, but that is actually how the that is how the world works. It's full of it's swirly, and but again, we're grown up women. We if someone has that conversation with me over a cup of coffee, I get it, and then really, I think the answer is then looking to the companies where they're surfacing all of the trial evidence that does exist. They're not overclaiming on product. They're not breaking any regulatory rules in terms of health claims, but they are sharing what they do know, because then we as humans, it takes a little bit of effort, but we can look into the evidence, and then we can make a decision ourselves. And I think that's really what we need to feel much more comfortable with enabling females in midlife to do, because I know from our own community, and I know from our own community studies, these botanicals can have huge potential, and nature packs a powerful punch. And there's another irony that I often find, that, you have this camp that says these botanicals do nothing, it's a complete waste of money. But obviously there's loads of contraindications, so don't take it if you're on medication. And it's like, well, it can't be doing both. It can't be a sort of panacea and also dangerous to take at the same time. So, I mean, we're very, very respectful of how powerful these botanicals are, but we also see phenomenal results because they are so powerful. And my hope would be that if we can surface some of more of this stuff, I do think that regulatory change needs to happen, and we lobby for that really actively as a business, because actually that will help innovation happen. And at the moment, we're just quashing innovation, and the end game, really, if we continue down the conversation we're having at the moment, is that the only approved protocol will be hormone therapy. And again, I'm a huge advocate of it, but if we can't talk about supplements, we can't promote botanicals, we can't we can't innovate in that space, then it actually removes choice for women.
But isn't it funny that bioidentical hormone therapy is made from yams? Isn't that the ultimate hilarious? Isn't that just, I don't know. It's not made from something that was it's and so often prescription medicine is, right? I mean, it's and so I think there is a way through. And again, the optimist in me feels, and a little bit to your point around that kind of the nuance between journalism and activism, I kind of feel that actually inherently there's quite a lot of activism that needs to take place within the menopause space and within female health, not just siloing menopause, because a lot of the conversations and a lot of the difficulty that we're having in how this life stage is supported and fully talked about is that the systems themselves are broken, and the systems around female health have been broken forever. And this is just one of the systems that are broken, is that the botanicals need intelligent people to sit around a table and talk about how we can more effectively and confidently look to assessing potential and ensuring safety. That conversation is not being had. Yeah. But in addition, there are so many other systems that surround female health that aren't being addressed actively, and it makes it so hard for us as individuals to be well. And it kind of feels like, I feel like we're in this fight as females for our bodies
at this moment in time more than ever. And all of these little silos, like menopause, is one of them in a way need to come together to address, the role of females.
Yeah. And I mean, it would be so wonderful if women in their 30s would start coming up with a game plan and figuring stuff out earlier so that it didn't hit you like a, barn door. And I think that's probably one place to focus on. But,
yeah, I totally agree.
Well, I'm thinking about I'm just interested in botanicals. Like, what are your favorite ingredients that you use?
Well,
and how did you come to
use? I mean, I always caveat this conversation segment when I'm talking to wonderful people like you, in that I'm a consumer of botanicals as opposed to an expert in them, and I'm very, very lucky to have Dr. Martins as my guide, and also the kind of the brains behind our blends, because I found them incredibly helpful for me personally. So I've been really open about how hard perimenopause was for me and how fundamental food and herbs were in my route back to feeling well again. But I was equally as confused as anyone coming into our community about what to take, what works with what, how long do I take it for, what's safe, what's not at different stages. And that continues to concern me, because botanicals actually work best when they are blended synergistically. And the ones that I really love are in formulations where they're able to do that. And also I know that they are at safe therapeutic dosage levels for me. So I love ashwagandha. I always say to people, if they're looking to try ashwagandha as a sort of single intervention, to look for ashwagandha KSM 66, because to our conversation earlier about the EFSA, ashwagandha KSM 66 is one of the only patented extracts of ashwagandha. And when you buy that, it means you do know that it's gone through clinical trials, that every time you buy it, it will be the same, it will have the same components in it. It's organic. It's got this really lovely, clean extraction technique, so that, sometimes when something's in extract, it's kind of not extracted in a way that's particularly clean, but this is a really beautiful way of doing it. And with ashwagandha, because it's an adaptogen, you get so many benefits just from that single plant. And that's why I love botanicals as well, is they're not just sort of single target. They do so many things. And ashwagandha looks to support anxiety. It can help with cognitive function. It can help with libido, because it's addressing some of the hormone signals relating to anxiety. It can help with sleep and focus. And it's actually open as a herb to many of us. There are always contraindications you need to consider, but for the vast majority of us, ashwagandha is something that we can all experiment with. Have you tried it?
Yes. And first of all, that's a great tip about the specific kind of ashwagandha. That's a great, great tip. Yes, I have tried it, and I perhaps need to try it again, because I was taking it, and this is, I think, a contraindication that not a lot of people know about. But I had a leaky gut, and I went to this awesome wellness center on Koh Samui in Thailand called Kamalaya, and they were unbelievable. Like the sessions I had there. And one of the doctors said, I think you shouldn't be taking ashwagandha, which my doctor had told me to take, because she said it's a nightshade, and I think it's caught irritating your gut lining. And I stopped taking it, and I think it was, but it's difficult to know because I was taking many things. And I was just thinking the other day, like, now that my gut is healed up, if I could incorporate it a little bit again.
Interesting.
So I think that might be one area where maybe it's not. Yes. Because if you've had a leaky gut and you're tending to your gut, I think, this, like, sometimes you have to be careful about certain foods. Like, I don't ever want to say no foods are good, but I'm not going to eat much zucchini probably ever again, because it's just, I already have that propensity. So sorry, I'm not on the ashwagandha train, but I always tell people about it, because it does have so many benefits. It does. But every ingredient will have someone that it doesn't work for, right? Like too, and it's like, there's people who just can't take it. Like, I was surprised to find out also turmeric. There's some people that just have a variation that they can't handle turmeric, and I believe I'm one of them. So, I don't know. This is like the tricky part.
It's fascinating, and you do have to be your own researcher and be really robust in your assessment of what you introduce. I think that back to that conversation around curiosity, that's the best thing that we can do in midlife is try things, but try them in a way that you're really paying attention to what you're putting into your body and how you're moving your body. And then if it doesn't serve you, you move on. But I mean, leaky gut, I think, is, again, not to want to go off on a tangent, something that we don't talk enough about because it's very common in menopause. We know that menopause impacts our metabolic rate. We also know that it impacts our gut microbiota, but we often don't talk about the fact that that also impacts, and many more of us become susceptible to leaky gut, and that obviously impacts inflammation and can have a huge impact on our long-term health if it's not identified. And we don't identify it enough. We kind of put up with what we feel like is just a bit of gas or a little bit of discomfort, and we just push on through as women. So it's so good that you actually got that diagnosis and the support then to heal it, because the great thing about our guts is we can do so much to make them well again.
Yeah. And then if you just keep tending it, Kirsty Holland is a traditional Chinese medicine specialist in Australia. And she always says we heal and seal the gut first.
Yes.
And then when that happens, we can sort of start to move on. And you see, and it's true, because now I know, say I was to go on vacation and have a few drinks and not eat the best food, eat some American food, I would start to feel it.
Yeah.
I would start to feel it coming. And then it's sort of, your gut is, your whole body, like, it is brilliant because it will start to repair. But if you kind of pummel it with the wrong things, it
lets you know.
Worse, so.
Yeah.
Okay. So another thing that's maligned is naturopathy and naturopathic medicine. You've worked with naturopathic doctors, and often they're out in the forefront on menopause and perimenopause care. Like, I don't know, have you seen a naturopathic doctor yourself personally? What's your take on it? And why?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because Dr. Martins is a naturopath, herbalist, and lifestyle medicine practitioner. She's been working in menopause clinics for 15 years alongside medical doctors in the UK. And you're right, there does seem to be this this concern around naturopathy. And when I look at it as a consumer, for me, naturopathy makes a huge amount of sense in that really what it advocates for is a 360 approach to your body. It takes into account your mind and your lifestyle as well. It's incredibly respectful of medical protocols, which is why so many naturopaths work alongside medical practices within the UK. So if you go to see a private menopause doctor, for example, in the UK, it would be very common to have a naturopath and herbalist working alongside them. So I don't really understand why there's such a concern around the systems that they advocate for. Very often they've been at the forefront, not just of menopause, but also of some traditional practices that have been handed down by generations that we're now beginning to realize have huge potential. So they have been tapping for a long time. We're now obviously seeing a lot of benefit from emotional freedom technique or tapping. Acupuncture, huge advocates of acupuncture for a long, long time. Huge advocates of breath work, huge advocates of yoga. They take that kind of holistic view because they recognize that our body is significantly impacted by external stressors, and all of those protocols help soothe stress and therefore soothe our bodies and our minds, and critically in menopause, the way that our hormones behave. So I'm, a down and out fan of naturopathy, and the only caveat I would place with that is, again, working with naturopaths who really do take the science and rigor side of what they do seriously. So Dr. Martins was a natural fit for me as a researcher in that she'd actually trained as a cancer biologist. She'd spent her whole career in the lab in pharmaceuticals until she fell in love with the potential of plants. And so she still applies that rigor. So if you look at any of the formulations that she's made with us, she's a lover of ashwagandha because ashwagandha is one of the best researched adaptogens. She's a lover of lemon balm because it's one of the best researched botanicals. So she will actually consciously sort of step away from herbs. She knows have a huge amount of potential, but we don't have robust data to support them at the moment. And that's absolutely fine, because our job right now is to ensure people feel really confident doing the protocols that we recommend. And that means sometimes letting that science catch up. And that's what she does beautifully. But yeah, I love naturopathy. Have you seen a naturopath?
Yeah, in my life earlier when I was in perimenopause, they didn't say anything to me about perimenopause, but she did help me greatly. And yes, there were supplements. And that's one of the criticisms, is that they'll just prescribe a whole bunch of expensive
Yeah.
supplements. But yeah, early on in my perimenopause, she helped me a lot without saying anything about you might be in perimenopause. So I wanted to get your advice for someone who's really struggling right now in perimenopause. What would you say to them?
Well, as we said at the beginning, I think every journey is different. Knowing you're in perimenopause is incredibly helpful. If they're really struggling, I do still believe that you should make your doctor your friend, and go and have a conversation first and foremost with your medical practitioner about how you're feeling, because there's a complexity to perimenopause where sometimes our body needs other support beyond HRT. We need to discount other underlying health conditions. If it's diagnosed as perimenopause and it's clearly nothing else, then I think the biggest first step is often looking at how you're digesting stress. And that's not to sort of belittle any of the other symptoms, but if you're feeling incredibly anxious and incredibly stressed, a bit to your point around sleep, nothing else is going to work as effectively as it should. And quite often this is a moment in time where we need to just be kind to ourselves and look at the way that we're living and how we can do more to sort of nurture and nourish ourselves. And I think, how we manage stress can be a great place to start. And there are so many protocols that we now know have strong scientific backing behind them. It can feel really sort of flippant to sort of encourage someone who's really, really struggling to meditate, for example, or to try breath work. But we do know that it's almost something you just need to trust the process and try. And again, use that kind of curiosity and that kind of researcher's mindset to see if it works for you. But accept that you're going to need a period of time where you're trying things, and get that doctor to support you in whatever decision you choose to make is the first step. Try things. If they don't work, try something else. Talk to people like you who are a little bit further on the journey. And I think generally finding your tribe or your community is really, really helpful. And quite often they may not be close friends. They may be people that you feel comfortable talking to because they're not. And that's okay as well. So those would be kind of the places I would start. And actually, for me, it was a kind of that balance of whole food and herbs. But I'm very, very conscious that at the same time, I did an awful lot to change my stress levels. And those tools actually have evolved over time. But I remember getting about 3 months into meditating every morning for 10 minutes. And I was so unconvinced that it was going to do anything. And I was annoyed at myself for doing it every morning. But I kind of decided I'd do it for 3 months and see if it had an impact. And I remember almost like this recognition about 3 months in. It was almost like a light bulb moment. The first thing I realized was you don't have to be good at it. It's not that you can win at meditating. And I've approached most of my my life thinking I needed to get good at it. And it's like, oh no, you don't get good at that or yoga. You just practice. And I remember being in a situation where I kind of came out of it and I thought, I don't react like I used to react 3 months ago. I reacted to that very differently. And I felt like there was a space that had opened up between my knee-jerk desire to respond in a certain way, which wouldn't have been good for me or the situation, and the way that my body and mind actually did respond. And also my fight or flight didn't kick in like it would have done. And then I attribute it back to that consistent 10 minutes every day. And that's something I still do without fail. So I think, be curious, try things, but also give them time and see if they impact you. And if they do, this can be an opportunity to kind of unpack a huge amount of stuff. And it's not easy and it can be incredibly frustrating, but ultimately it gives us almost like a blueprint to be well for part two. I think that's the potential of perimenopause, is if we allow ourselves the time to actually focus in on ourselves, which we've absolutely earned, let's face it, then part two can be really, really, an opportunity to put yourself first, which is good.
Oh, that's lovely. I think the problem is the problems of perimenopause are very jarring, and positive shifts are much more subtle and nuanced. So, it's just,
Totally.
you got to have the patience.
And you actually don't know you're out it until you're looking back quite a long way. I don't know if you felt this as well, but we were talking about this before we started recording, but I've only really become aware that I'm feeling in a very different place relatively recently. But when I think back to the 43-year-old me, there were points where I could have quite happily laid down on the floor and just not got up again. And I just had nothing left in me, nothing, no desire to be curious, no desire to try anything new. I just wanted someone to make it better. And I think, that is the reality for so many of us. But back to our early conversation, it's because we're not taught to expect it, and we're not taught to basically discover our bodies early enough.
It is something else, but I love the way you talk about it. Okay, so what's next for Liminal?
So what's next for Liminal? We have another formulation innovation that we'll be testing with our community later this year, which is a really interesting one, which again has come back from all the feedback we get around the most persistent and troubling symptoms. So we will be launching a new product, hopefully towards the end of this year. We're also doing a lot more just to create that wraparound support. So what I've learned over the last 3 or 4 years is the value of these other interventions alongside our protocols. And regardless of whether you're on hormone therapy or you're on our formulations or you're on both, working with someone and understanding the potential and the science behind journaling, for example, or on tapping. And there's so much research behind it. I didn't know quite how much there really was. And it's free. It's really quick. It has immediate results. And yet most of us haven't even heard of it. Or if we have, we put it in the woo camp, and it really isn't in the woo camp. So we're doing a lot more sort of masterclasses with really interesting practitioners. And I'm increasingly becoming, probably comfortable is the right word, comfortable as a researcher to start challenging some of the narratives that I feel are unhelpful. So what I hope will happen with Liminal is a lot more of the research that we do within our community sort of coming to light and prompting healthy discussion about females' wants and needs and experiences, because I also feel like we need to open up the kind of the tapestry of lived experience. So to your friend who's really struggling at the moment, there are more nuanced stories that she can turn to and hopefully see elements of herself in. And, that's always been the intention with the community part of Liminal, is that I'm a huge, I get the privilege of listening to all these stories, and I want them to kind of reach more people, because I think that in a way is a way to combat this sort of binary sort of pendulum swim we've had in the UK for some time, and we're seeing now in the US as well, is the richer that the narratives are, the more likely someone's going to see themselves in one of them and feel less alone.
Listen, thank you so much. It's lovely to speak with you.
It's always so lovely to speak to you. Thank you for having me.
Hot Flash Inc. was created and is hosted by Anne-Marie McQueen, produced and edited by Sonia Mack. The information contained in this podcast is intended for informational purposes only and is not intended for the purpose of diagnosing, treating, curing, or preventing any disease. Before using any products referenced on the podcast, consult with your healthcare provider, read all labels, and heed all directions and cautions that accompany the products. Information received through the podcast should not be used in place of a consultation or advice from a healthcare provider. If you suspect you have a medical problem, i.e. menopause or anything else, or any healthcare questions, please promptly see your healthcare provider. This podcast, including Anne-Marie McQueen and any producers or editors, disclaim any responsibility from any possible adverse effects from the use of any information contained herein. Opinions of guests on this podcast are their own, and the podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about a guest's qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements and advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. This podcast is owned by Hot Flash Inc.